There's a silence that hits differently after you've pushed someone away, the kind that doesn't echo with relief, but with realization. For the avoidant, that silence comes too late. In the beginning, losing their anxious ex feels like freedom, space, control restored. No more texts asking, "Are you okay?" No more emotional conversations that made them feel trapped or exposed. For the first time in a long time, they can breathe, or at least, that's what they tell themselves. But underneath that calm surface, a quiet unease begins to take shape. Because the very person they pushed away was the one who cared the most. Avoidantly attached individuals often live by a simple, unspoken rule: distance equals safety. When emotions grow too intense, they retreat. When love starts feeling like dependence, they disconnect. To them, independence isn't just comfort, it's survival. But what they rarely understand until much later is that their anxious partner wasn't trying to control them. They were trying to connect. In the anxious-avoidant bond, the anxious partner often becomes the emotional bridge, the one reaching out, initiating repair, holding the relationship together through sheer effort. The avoidant interprets that energy as pressure, as suffocation, and so they back away. They mistake devotion for demand, love for intrusion. And when they finally walk away, they feel powerful, detached, self-contained. But something begins to shift in the quiet that follows. The texts stop. The calls fade. The anxious ex, after months of chasing, finally lets go. That's when the avoidant starts to feel it, the absence that doesn't feel peaceful anymore. The freedom they fought for begins to feel hollow. Because in that silence, they no longer hear someone loving them despite their walls. They only hear their own echo. And regret, for the avoidant, doesn't come like a sudden storm. It seeps in slowly, through small memories, through the realization that the one person who understood their moods, their silences, their contradictions is gone. And this time, they're not coming back. If you want to better understand how to deal with avoidance, then subscribe to the channel to know everything. At first, the avoidant tells themselves it was the right decision. They needed space. They needed to focus on themselves. The relationship was too much. They convinced themselves the anxious ex will move on quietly, or maybe even wait around, like before. But when that doesn't happen, when silence becomes the new normal, the avoidant's internal landscape begins to shift. Avoidants often confuse emotional intensity with danger. The anxious partner's deep need for reassurance once felt overwhelming, a mirror reflecting everything the avoidant didn't want to face. Their own fear of intimacy, their discomfort with being truly seen. So they ran. They labeled the relationship as toxic, dramatic, or emotionally draining. But months later, when the emotional noise is gone, they begin to notice something unexpected, a deep, persistent ache. The avoidant starts replaying the small things. The way the anxious partner noticed details no one else did. The way they cared enough to ask, "Are you okay?" even when the answer was silence. The way they stayed, even when it hurt. They remember those things now, not with irritation, but with longing. Because behind all that intensity was something rare, unconditional love. Avoidants are used to being pursued. It affirms their belief that closeness can be controlled. But when the anxious ex finally stops reaching out, that control dissolves. For the first time, the avoidant becomes the one left waiting. They check their phone, not to respond, but to see if that familiar name appears. It doesn't. And that absence starts to sting in places they didn't know could ache. Regret doesn't hit the avoidant all at once. It creeps in between moments of quiet, a song they once shared, a scent that pulls them back, a memory that suddenly feels too vivid. What once felt like peace now feels like punishment. Because what they're realizing isn't just that they lost someone who loved them. They lost someone who understood them, even when they couldn't explain themselves. It's in this silence that the avoidant begins to understand something they never did before. Distance doesn't protect you from pain. Sometimes, it's the very thing that creates it. There comes a moment, maybe late at night, maybe in a quiet drive home, when the avoidant feels it, the memory of a person they thought they'd outgrown. It's not the loud kind of missing, the desperate yearning of new heartbreak. It's subtler, quieter, like an echo that refuses to fade. Avoidants often mistake emotional peace for emotional emptiness. In the beginning, they revel in their solitude. They get back to their routines, their independence, their control. But the human heart, even one wrapped in armor, has memory. It remembers warmth. It remembers care. And so the anxious ex, the one who once felt too much, starts appearing everywhere, not in person, but in traces. A song lyric that suddenly means something. A familiar scent in a stranger's perfume. The way someone else laughs, almost but not quite the same. These moments pierce the avoidant's calm exterior, because they realize that the connection they dismissed wasn't about dependency, it was about belonging. The anxious partner's emotional depth wasn't weakness, it was presence. And presence is something the avoidant rarely allows themselves to feel. Now, in their absence, the avoidant is haunted not by what was said, but by what was meant. They remember the anxious partner's patience, how they stayed through the cold silences, how they kept trying to reach the part of the avoidant that didn't know how to receive love. Back then, it felt invasive. Now it feels irreplaceable. Regret, for the avoidant, is a mirror. It forces them to see what they once judged as clinginess, as devotion. What they called neediness was actually emotional courage, the bravery to love someone who kept pulling away. The anxious ex didn't love to control, they loved to connect. And now, as the avoidant stares into that mirror, they realize something devastating. They weren't running from pressure. They were running from love itself. That's the cruel twist of avoidance. By protecting themselves from hurt, they often create the very loneliness they feared all along. At first, the avoidant calls it clarity. The space feels cleansing, almost liberating. They convince themselves they've escaped emotional chaos, that losing the anxious ex was an act of self-preservation, not loss. They focus on productivity, on friends, on hobbies that once felt neglected. On the surface, everything looks balanced. But beneath that balance, a quiet dissonance starts to hum. Avoidants are masters of emotional suppression. They don't process pain, they postpone it. So when regret begins to stir, they don't recognize it right away. It starts subtly, a passing thought, a restless night, a sudden wave of irritation for no clear reason. Their mind keeps drifting back to their ex, but they frame it as curiosity, not longing. They replay old conversations, wondering if they were too harsh, too distant, too certain. Over time, the memories become heavier. They remember how their anxious partner used to anticipate their moods, how they could feel when something was wrong before words were spoken. They remember the small gestures, the soft touches, the quiet patience, the constant reassurance that they once labeled as too much. Those gestures now stand out as the moments they took for granted. This is the cruel irony of avoidance. They often realize love's value only in its absence. Because for them, love has always been synonymous with risk, the risk of exposure, of rejection, of losing themselves. So they avoid it, push it away, rationalize the distance as strength. But eventually, the silence that once felt like safety begins to sound like loneliness. And in that stillness, they start to remember who their anxious ex really was. Not a pursuer, not a threat, but a person who tried to meet them where they were, even when it hurt. Someone who loved them through walls and silence, through mixed signals and withdrawal. Someone who didn't need perfection, just presence. The avoidant doesn't usually admit this out loud. They might tell others they've moved on, that it just wasn't meant to be. But their mind says otherwise. It wanders back to what was safe, what was warm, what was human. The very thing they once feared is now the thing they quietly crave. And though they'll never say it, not yet, they've begun to miss the person who made them feel something real. Regret doesn't announce itself. It seeps in through the cracks of routine, quietly rearranging how the avoidant remembers the past. They scroll through old photos, not out of nostalgia, but out of confusion, trying to understand how something that felt so suffocating then feels so sacred now. The distance they once demanded has turned into an emotional wasteland, and in that silence, words they never said begin to echo louder than ever. Avoidants rarely express remorse directly. Vulnerability still feels dangerous, even when they're alone. So instead of admitting they miss their anxious ex, they rationalize it. I just wonder how they're doing. Or they were actually a good person. But beneath those mental justifications is a deeper truth. They're haunted by the things they never said when it mattered. They remember the moments their ex reached out with trembling honesty, asking, "Do you even love me?" and how they responded with silence, deflection, or irritation. They remember the times they withdrew instead of explaining, the nights they left messages unread just to avoid confrontation. At the time, it felt easier. Distance always did. But now those small silences feel enormous. They weren't moments of control. They were missed chances to connect. The avoidant begins to see what the anxious ex was really asking for. Not constant reassurance, but emotional safety. They didn't want control. They wanted closeness. They weren't trying to cage love. They were trying to protect it. And the avoidant, too afraid to trust that kind of love, mistook it for threat. Now, they replay those moments differently. The same messages they once ignored would mean something entirely different if they arrived today. Because with time comes clarity, the understanding that what they once rejected wasn't weakness, it was devotion. And the anxious ex wasn't asking for too much. They were asking to be met halfway. But the cruel truth of avoidance is that realization almost always arrives when it's too late. The person they pushed away has learned to heal themselves. They've stopped reaching. They've stopped waiting. And the avoidant, for the first time, begins to feel what their ex once felt: uncertainty, longing, the ache of emotional distance. It's in this reversal that the lesson begins. The roles have shifted. The one who once ran is now the one standing still, waiting for something that no longer comes back. There's a point, somewhere after the silence sets in, when the avoidant realizes the power dynamic has shifted, and it's not in their favor anymore. For so long, they held control through distance. They decided when to engage, when to disappear, when to allow closeness, and when to retreat. The anxious partner adapted to that rhythm, always reaching, always forgiving. But when that pursuit ends, when the anxious one finally chooses peace over persistence, the avoidance control evaporates. Avoidants often rely on emotional predictability. They find comfort in knowing that someone will always be there no matter how far they pull away. It reaffirms their belief that love is safe only when it's one-sided, when they're the ones who get to dictate the terms. But when the anxious ex stops reaching, that predictability shatters. Suddenly, the avoidant is the one left wondering. They start checking social media, scrolling not out of interest, but out of panic. Are they seeing someone new? Do they even think about me anymore? They tell themselves it's curiosity, but it's not. It's loss, the kind that comes from realizing the person who once waited for them no longer will. This reversal isn't just about ego. It's about emotional exposure. The avoidant, who once believed detachment was safety, now experiences what it feels like to be on the other side, to be unseen, unanswered, uncertain. It's an unfamiliar vulnerability that feels almost unbearable because it mirrors what their ex once lived through. And for the first time, empathy begins to break through the armor. They start to understand what it must have felt like to love someone who was always half present, half here. To constantly reach across emotional distance, hoping for a connection that never came. The avoidant won't admit it, but they begin to feel small pangs of guilt. Not the loud kind that demands forgiveness, but the quiet kind that lingers. The kind that shows up when they realize they were loved deeply, and they met that love with walls. And as that awareness deepens, They start to grasp something they'd never seen before. Control was never the same as security. It only kept them safe from the very thing they needed most: connection. Now, standing in the emptiness they once mistook for freedom, the avoidant begins to see that what they thought was power was actually fear. And that realization, more than anything else, is what begins to hurt. Regret has a strange way of resurfacing, not as sudden heartbreak, but as subtle reminders that appear in moments of quiet. For the avoidant, it doesn't come as longing at first. It comes as curiosity. They start to wonder where their anxious ex is now, what they're doing, who they've become without them. They might even send a casual message, "Hey, just checking in." It sounds innocent, but underneath it is a storm of unspoken emotion. Avoidants don't reach out to reconnect. They reach out to relieve the discomfort of absence. They want to know that the bridge they once burned still stands, that the door they closed isn't locked forever. Because even though they left, they need to believe they could return if they ever wanted to. That hope, that illusion of control, comforts them, until it doesn't. When their anxious ex no longer responds the way they used to, no longer eager, no longer waiting, the avoidant feels something they've avoided their whole life: rejection. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, dignified kind. The kind where someone has finally healed enough not to need you anymore. And that's when the weight of regret truly settles in. Because the avoidant starts to see what was lost, not just in the relationship, but in themselves. They remember how that anxious partner saw beauty in their guardedness, how they looked past the withdrawal and believed there was softness underneath. The ex saw something worth loving even when the avoidant was too afraid to show it. And now, no one else looks at them that way. Avoidants often spend years perfecting the art of detachment, but nothing prepares them for the emptiness that follows genuine love lost. They thought the connection could be replaced, that affection, attraction, and intimacy were interchangeable. But now, faced with emotional silence, they realized that what they had was singular. It wasn't chaotic, it was alive. And in that stillness, they begin to see how much they took for granted. The late-night messages, the open arms after every withdrawal, the emotional generosity that never demanded perfection, only presence. What they called too much was actually someone giving everything they could, despite not being met halfway. Now, the avoidant replays it differently. They imagine what it would have been like to stay, to open up, to try. They see moments they could have spoken but didn't, loved but held back, cared but hid it. And each "what if" becomes a quiet ache, a haunting reminder that the love they once feared was the very love they needed. It happens unexpectedly, not in a grand moment of realization, but in something small: hearing a song they both loved, walking past a place that still holds their laughter, or stumbling upon an old message that once went unanswered. The avoidant freezes, because for the first time, they don't just remember the relationship, they feel it. Avoidants spend most of their lives avoiding feelings, not because they lack them, but because they run too deep. Emotional detachment is their armor, and silence is their shield. But time, distance, and loneliness have a way of softening even the strongest defenses. And now, when they think about their anxious ex, it's not with irritation or guilt, it's with tenderness. That's the moment regret stops being abstract and becomes real. They start to understand that the anxious partner wasn't asking for perfection. They weren't asking for endless reassurance or control. They were asking for closeness, to know they mattered, to feel safe, to love without walking on eggshells. But the avoidant couldn't give that, not because they didn't care, but because caring felt dangerous. Now, with the distance they once craved, they finally see what they pushed away: not pressure, but presence. They remember how their ex would sense their moods before they spoke, how they made space for silence without demanding explanation. Back then, that attentiveness felt invasive. Now, it feels like something they'd give anything to have back. They scroll through old conversations, tracing the kindness in words they once dismissed. They realize how lucky they were to be loved that fully, that fearlessly. But here's the hardest part. They also realize it's over. That kind of love doesn't wait forever. The anxious ex has grown. They've learned to soothe themselves, to set boundaries, to stop chasing love that hides behind walls. The avoidant doesn't just miss the person. They miss the version of themselves that could have been, if only they'd stayed open. This is where the regret deepens, because it's not just about losing someone else. It's about losing the chance to become someone better through love. They start to understand that avoidance didn't protect them from pain. It postponed it, and now it's arriving all at once. And as they sit in that truth, something shifts quietly inside. For the first time, they don't want to run. They want to feel, even if it hurts. Because feeling means they finally understand what they once couldn't. That love was never the threat. Fear was. Avoidants don't usually talk about missing someone. They bury it beneath logic, telling themselves it wasn't the right time, or that it wasn't meant to be. But longing has a way of bypassing logic. It doesn't ask for permission. It seeps into the quiet moments. The drive home after work, the empty side of the bed, the messages left unsent. And this longing, for the avoidant, is different. It's not about wanting the anxious ex back just to fill the space. It's about wanting the feeling they never let themselves fully experience. They start to realize that love wasn't supposed to feel like loss of control. It was supposed to feel like trust, a space to be seen and still safe. The anxious partner tried to build that space for them, over and over, even as the avoidant pushed it away. They offered patience where others offered distance, compassion where others offered conditions. That's what makes the regret so heavy now, because the avoidant finally sees the difference between being loved and being tolerated. They replay the last conversations in their mind. The anxious ex's voice, calm, tired, but still kind, saying, "I can't keep doing this." At the time, the avoidant thought it was just another emotional reaction. They didn't realize it was the sound of someone reaching their limit, of someone choosing peace over pain. Now, that memory cuts deeper than any argument ever did. Avoidants often believe they'll have another chance, that when they're ready, they can go back and make it right. But when they do reach out, it's different. The anxious ex responds politely, maybe even warmly, but the depth is gone. The emotional cord that once bound them has been quietly severed. And that's when the avoidant truly feels it. Not rejection, but the unmistakable truth that they're no longer needed. This is where the lesson takes root. They start to see that love isn't about control or independence. It's about presence. The anxious ex once offered them that presence without condition. Now, they understand what a gift that was. And what they feel isn't just heartbreak, it's humility. Because they finally see that what they once dismissed as too emotional was actually emotional strength. And for the first time, the avoidant doesn't wish to forget. They want to remember, not to reopen the wound, but to learn from it. Because losing someone who loved you in spite of your fear teaches you the most painful, precious truth of all. That love was never something to survive. It was something to surrender to. There's a moment, often quiet, unremarkable, when the avoidant stops wishing for their anxious ex to return. Instead, they wish they'd been different when they had the chance. That's when regret transforms into something else entirely, awareness. It's no longer about loss. It's about understanding what the loss revealed. Avoidants live most of their lives protecting themselves from love's uncertainty. But what they learn, often painfully late, is that love was never the enemy. Fear was. Fear of being known. Fear of being seen without defense. Fear that closeness would swallow them whole when, in truth, it could have set them free. Now, looking back, they see their anxious ex with new eyes. Not as someone too emotional or too needy, but as someone who loved courageously. Someone who showed them what emotional presence looks like, staying, even when it's hard, loving, even when it hurts. The avoidant remembers how that love felt like light shining through the cracks in their armor. It terrified them then. It humbles them now. They begin to realize that the anxious ex didn't lose the avoidant. The avoidant lost themselves in their own walls. The real tragedy isn't that the relationship ended. It's that it ended before the avoidant learned how to stay. And yet, hidden within that regret is something sacred, the seed of change. Because once an avoidant truly feels what it's like to lose a love that was safe and patient, they can never unsee it. Maybe they'll meet again one day. Maybe not. But the anxious ex will always be the one who shifted something in them, who taught them that intimacy doesn't mean losing yourself. It means finally coming home to yourself through another. In the quiet after the storm, the avoidant sits with that truth. They scroll through their phone one last time, hover over the old thread, and then set it down. Not out of anger or denial, but out of respect for the person who loved them when they couldn't love themselves. And for the first time, instead of running from the ache, they let it stay. Because this time, they understand. Feeling it is how healing begins. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more insights, and repost this to help others understand the quiet heartbreak of avoidance and the love that could have changed everything.